Why do some people keep repeating the same painful patterns, no matter how badly life hits them? Why does advice go in one ear and out the other for certain people, no matter how wise it is? And perhaps the most puzzling question, why do smart, kind, even well-educated people still refuse to grow? Some people live their entire lives stuck in the same loops. They sabotage their own success, dismiss good advice, blame everyone else, and even when life slaps them hard, they still don't get it. Why? It's not a matter of intelligence. It's not about education. It's not even about how much pain they've endured. The root lies in psychological resistance to growth, what Carl Jung called the refusal to confront the shadow. You see, stupidity isn't always loud or obvious. It can wear the mask of confidence, stubbornness, or even kindness, but deep down, psychological stupidity is the refusal to integrate truth. And truth, it's uncomfortable. It demands humility. It challenges the ego. And that's where the wall goes up. When someone's ego has built its identity around always being right, always being the victim, or just being who I am, learning feels threatening. Change feels terrifying. Self-reflection feels like self-destruction. So instead of evolving, they double down, they defend their dysfunction, they surround themselves with people who won't challenge them. They twist reality to preserve a fragile self-image. This is what Jung meant when he said, thinking is difficult, that's why most people judge. Learning requires thinking. Judging is easier. Blaming feels safer. Staying the same is far more comfortable. And make no mistake, there's a kind of stupidity that becomes addictive. The more someone avoids truth, the more they live in fantasy. And the more that fantasy is threatened, the more defensive, aggressive, and blind they become. This isn't a lack of intelligence, it's a lack of inner courage. Because real learning means looking in the mirror and saying, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I've been the problem. Maybe I need to start over. And for many, that level of honesty is unbearable. So they stay stuck, trapped in cycles they secretly despise, complaining about the same problems they quietly create, nodding to truth but never absorbing it. It's not that they can't learn, it's that they don't want to. Because learning would mean changing, and change demands ego death. And this kind of psychological stupidity doesn't stop at one person. It spreads to families, to friend groups, to entire systems. Sometimes it isn't loud. Sometimes it shows up as quiet compliance or hides behind tradition. Or worse, pride. Because once ignorance becomes part of one's identity, truth becomes the enemy. We saw how ego resists truth. But what if that resistance starts as early as childhood, shaped before we even understand the word truth? In many families, when a child asks a question, something that should be celebrated, they're instead silenced. Not with answers, but with anger, guilt, or cold, punishing silence. Why? Because their parents were raised the same way. They were never allowed to question anything either. They never learned how to reflect, only how to obey, how to survive. And so the cycle continues. Over time, not asking questions becomes a virtue. Not challenging authority gets labeled as loyalty. Suppressing your voice is mistaken for respect. But that's not wisdom, it's generational cowardice dressed up as morality. This shows up in communities too. Places where leaders mock introspection, where ego is idolized, where the loudest man is seen as the strongest even if he has no substance. It happens in workplaces, politics, religion, and education, in systems that reward conformity, not growth, where it's safer to look busy than to actually think, where people are taught to compete but never to reflect. Carl Jung once warned, the greatest danger to civilization is not bad people, but the inability of people to think. Because when people can't or won't think for themselves, they become pawns, easily manipulated, easily triggered, easily led into hate, fear, and blind obedience. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Some people would rather stay dumb and certain than become wise and uncertain, because certainty feels safe even when it's built on lies. That's why true learning has nothing to do with IQ. It's not about how smart you are. It's about how much truth you can tolerate, how much discomfort you can endure, How deeply? You're willing to challenge your own narrative even if it breaks you a little. Stupidity isn't just ignorance, it's emotional defense. You might think someone is stupid because they lack knowledge, but that's just the surface. Underneath lies something far more human and far more dangerous: emotional avoidance. When someone refuses to learn from experience, when they shut down every attempt at self-reflection, when they treat feedback like a personal attack, it's not because they're unintelligent, it's because they're afraid. Afraid of what they'll uncover if they admit they were wrong. Afraid of the guilt that comes with awakening. Afraid of the shame that's been buried since childhood, still alive, still raw, still unresolved. And here's where psychology runs deep. Many people build their entire identity around emotional protection they've learned to survive by lying to themselves. They say things like, "I don't need anyone. That's just who I am. It's not my fault." We saw how emotional defense becomes a prison. Now, we'll dive deeper into why so many choose to stay inside that prison even when the door is open. They say, "It's not my fault, it's theirs." But what they're really saying is, if I face the truth, I might fall apart. So, instead of learning, they defend. Instead of growing, they attack. Instead of evolving, they stagnate. Because stagnation feels safer than transformation. And this is where Carl Jung's concept of the shadow becomes essential. The shadow is the part of yourself you've repressed. The anger you were punished for. The fear you weren't allowed to show. The curiosity that was mocked. The truth that was too painful to accept, so you buried it. But buried emotions don't disappear. They turn into reactions, into judgments, into distorted lenses through which we view the world. And as Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That's why some people repeat the same mistake for 10, 20, even 30 years. Not because they can't change, but because change would require unearthing the pain they've spent a lifetime avoiding. So they choose the familiar over the free, the predictable over the true. They stay stuck and call it stability. But make no mistake, the deepest kind of stupidity isn't about logic. It's about emotional cowardice. At this point, you might be wondering, if emotional avoidance and ego defense are the roots, what's the way out? It's a fair question. But here's the uncomfortable answer. Most people don't want the way out. They say they want change. They say they want better relationships, a better life, a better version of themselves. But when you hand them truth, they flinch. When you hand them responsibility, they fold. When you offer them freedom, they run. Why? Because growth requires loss. The loss of who they think they are. The loss of old stories, old excuses, old comforts. And strangely enough, many would rather stay stuck in a familiar hell than risk stepping into an unknown freedom. Because in that freedom, they have no one left to blame. No scripts to hide behind. No, that's just how I am to cling to. They'd have to face themselves fully, completely, honestly. And the truth is, most people won't. That's why Jung once said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. That's why they sabotage opportunity. That's why they push away good partners. That's why they always have a reason. Life is unfair. People are fake. Nothing ever works. Because to admit the truth that the problem isn't always out there, and that sometimes the pattern is them, would mean doing the hardest thing of all, taking responsibility. We've seen that taking responsibility is the only way out, but it's also the heaviest burden to carry. Responsibility is weighty. It forces you to stare into the mirror without flinching. It asks you to stop blaming, stop running, stop hiding. But here's the twist. Not everyone can be helped, and not everyone should be helped. Some people must hit rock bottom emotionally, spiritually, psychologically before they become teachable, before they stop defending their smallness and start reclaiming their depth. You can't force someone to wake up. You can't argue them out of ignorance. You can't lecture them into self-awareness. All you can do is point to the door, but they have to walk through it alone. So if most people stay stuck, if most people avoid truth, if most never truly learn, then what makes the difference? What separates those who actually grow from those who only talk about growth? It's not intelligence, not success, not the number of books you've read or podcasts you've binged. It's one thing, radical self-honesty. The kind of honesty that churns your stomach, that keeps you up at night, that forces you to ask the questions most people run from. Where am I lying to myself? What truths am I avoiding? What patterns am I blaming on others that I keep repeating? This is where real learning begins. Because real growth isn't about information, it's about transformation, and transformation hurts. You'll lose beliefs, habits, and identities that once made you feel safe. But in that loss, you become something far more powerful, integrated, awake, whole. You believe that true individuation, the process of becoming your full self, requires confronting all the parts of you were taught to reject. The insecurity, the rage, the envy, the laziness, the fear. Not to judge them, but to understand them. Because once you bring awareness to those shadows, they stop running your life. And that's when you begin to truly learn. Not to impress, not to be perfect, but to wake up. Because when you're awake, you stop recycling pain, you stop blaming, you stop projecting, you stop living someone else's story and start writing your own. But that requires something most never develop: emotional endurance. The ability to sit in shame without fleeing, to face fear and still move forward, to be wrong and instead of defending it, to learn from it. That's the breaking point. That's the line between those who evolve and those who stay stuck forever. We saw that real growth demands the death of the false self, and that's exactly why it terrifies most people. Why? Because most people don't fall in love with truth, they fall in love with their image. They want to seem wise, to appear conscious, to sound deep. But here's the truth: you can't fake. In a work, you can memorize Jung quotes, you can meditate daily, journal at night, go to therapy every week. But if your motivation is still rooted in controlling your image or seeking validation, you're not healing, you're just accessorizing. Your ego. True growth strips you down. It humbles you. It breaks you in all the right places. And more often than not, it begins in a quiet, private moment. No one talks about the moment when you realize, I've been lying to myself for years. That's the initiation. The people who actually evolve don't get there because life was easy. They get there because something shattered their illusion. A heartbreak, a failure, a betrayal, or simply a silent moment where truth hit so hard it couldn't be ignored. And in that moment they didn't distract themselves. They didn't numb the pain. They didn't rush to rebuild the mask. They sat in the wreckage, because the ones who grow are the ones who stop running. And here's what they come to understand: the ego's greatest fear isn't failure, it's being seen without a mask. Raw, flawed, unfinished. But ironically, that's where your real power begins. When you stop hiding behind perfection, you start unlocking your true potential. Not the polished version, not the brand, but the real you anchored in integrity. The version of you that no longer fears being wrong, being called out, or being cracked open. That's the moment you shift from knowledge collector to self-liberator. Because here's the truth: most people don't stay stuck for lack of insight. They stay stuck because they weaponize insight to avoid responsibility. You can know everything and still change nothing. That's the trap. And the only way out is through radical self-confrontation. As Jung put it, you cannot awaken a person who is pretending to be asleep. You can't force clarity on someone still addicted to confusion. You can't teach truth to someone more loyal to their identity than to their evolution. But if you are the one ready to wake up, you don't need anyone's permission. You just need the courage to finally say, I'm done being asleep. When someone finally breaks the cycle, when they stop blaming, stop denying, stop performing, they step into a rare and sacred space. Self-confrontation without self-destructs. When someone dares to face themselves without falling apart, that's when ignorance ends and wisdom begins. Not because they suddenly became smarter, but because they became honest emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. They stopped pretending their wounds weren't real. They stopped blaming the world for everything that hurt. They stopped escaping into distractions, excuses, and half-truths. And when that moment comes, it doesn't feel like some grand enlightenment. It often feels like grief, because you begin to realize You've been carrying beliefs that were never truly yours, reacting to patterns you never questioned, living out roles you never consciously chose. You feel the weight of the years you wasted, the people you hurt, the parts of yourself you abandoned. But beneath that grief is clarity, and with clarity comes liberation. As Carl Jung said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. That pain is the price of freedom, and once you've walked through it, you stop fearing yourself. You're no longer at war with your past, no longer afraid of your shadow, no longer performing intelligence while avoiding truth. You become something. If you ever reach sane, grounded, clear, you start learning for real, not for appearances. You take responsibility not just for outcomes but for your reactions. You start catching yourself in old patterns, and instead of repeating them, you pause, you breathe, you choose differently. That's real intelligence. Not perfection, not status, but awareness, ownership, and courage to change. And then you realize something even deeper. Those who never learn aren't just unlucky. They're choosing blindness. But you don't have to, because the second you choose to see yourself clearly, you stop being a victim of your own mind. You start becoming dangerously conscious, dangerous to illusion, to denial, to everything that once kept you asleep. If this hits something deep in you, don't just scroll away. Take a breath. Ask yourself, what am I still pretending not to know? And if you're ready to wake up, to break the cycle, to truly see yourself, subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss the truth your soul is asking for. And if this spoke to you, drop a comment. I choose to see. Let's build a community of minds that refuse to stay asleep. You've made it to the end not because you needed more information, but because something inside you is waking up. We live in a world where everyone speaks, but few listen, where people want to look awakened, but few are brave enough to face themselves for real. If you're still here reading this, it means you're one of the rare ones. Who doesn't want to run anymore? You're done pretending. You don't need perfection. You just want truth. And here's the truth. You are not alone. We're building a community here, a space for those who choose awareness over blame, growth over performance, courage over avoidance. If you're ready to walk the path of awakening, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who's ready to see the world and themselves more clearly. And if today marks the start of your shift, drop a comment below. I choose truth. That's not just a comment. It's a commitment to yourself. See you in the next video, where we'll keep unmasking illusions, challenging the mind, and walking closer to your real self.